Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell. It's news and views from the Nefarium on Friday, March 13th, 2011. I got the year right. Somebody was complaining I never get the year right, and I don't, but anyway. And it is Friday afternoon. I am smoking my pipe, as you can see, or trying to get it going, keep it lit. I have a couple of announcements and a topic that I want to talk about. And then I am also going to be on later tonight with my members only vid chat. So I wanted to remind everybody about that. So, anyway, the announcement number one is Grid of the Gods is now up on my web store and at Amazon. So it is available for pre purchase. I don't know what exactly Amazon is saying. The book is supposed to be at the printer by now. I do want to make one thing crystal clear because I am really mad at my publisher. I have been fighting ever since my first series of books came out with this idea that I'm some sort of credentialed physicist. That was my publisher's doing. It is not mine. I am not a credentialed physicist, never have been, and never claim to be. So I want to make that very clear because on Amazon you're going to see that not only am I now tagged with that, but my co-author and friend Scott DeHart is also being titled as a physicist. And again, this is not our field of research. And I get so irritated at publishers sometimes that they just presume to do these things without checking with the author. I'm very upset about that because this is a good book. It's an important book in the series of books that I've planned. It's a book that is following on Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, and it's setting up the books that my co-author and I have set up and planned as sequels to this book. We're doing two books right now that are very, very important. They're going to be very controversial, but they're very, very important, and they're follow-ups to Genes, Giants, and to Grid of the Gods. So I want to make the record very clear here now tonight. Neither he nor I are credentialed physicists. Neither of us claim to be. This was our publisher's doing, and they did this without consultation with either of us. So that's the announcement. Announcement number two is I have a series of blogs scheduled next week, two, I think. And my topic in these blogs is going to be an anniversary, a rather sad anniversary that occurs tomorrow. That's the anniversary of the death 7 years ago of Dr. Eugene Malov, who was the founder of Infinite Energy magazine. And he was also the scientist, a credentialed scientist, a PhD from MIT, if I recall correctly, that during the cold fusion controversy that surrounded Pons and Fleischmann back in the, when was it, late 1980s, early 1990s, somewhere in there, I forget the date. But Dr. Malov wrote a very important book. I talk about this in the two blogs, and this is the reason for my announcement tonight about these blogs. And I might be talking a little bit about that also in the members' video chat later tonight. But Dr. Malov was murdered 7 years ago tomorrow in a rental property of his. The murder took place, so the police suspect, of two robbers that, the motivation was robbery. The two suspects were arrested a year later. They were released in 2008. Charges were dismissed. This essentially remains, as far as I'm aware, an unsolved murder. My suspicion, like many others, has always been that Dr. Malov was murdered because of his scientific credentials, because of his integrity. Because when the Pons and Fleischmann cold fusion story broke, as some of you probably know, they were vilified to no end by scientists, especially in this country, who were defending the standard model of thermonuclear reaction and basically denounced for fraudulent experiment, for misreading their data, all sorts of the usual standard stuff. Well, Dr. Malov published a book called Fire from Ice. I think it was in 1981 that the book was published. The book was a total examination of the whole cold fusion controversy, especially an examination of the responses of standard in-the-box thinking scientists to the claims of Pons and Fleischmann. Now, one of the things I point out in my upcoming blogs this next week, I forget what days I've scheduled them for, but there will be 2 blogs on the subject of Dr. Malov and the cold fusion controversy. One of the things that Dr. Malov pointed out and continued this story more or less when he founded Infinite Energy magazine as kind of a thread that he would pick up on and comment on from time to time, was that Japan was one of the countries after cold fusion was initially reported that jumped on to the phenomenon and committed serious personnel and funding research to the phenomenon. And it was the Japan Journal of Applied Physics, which is an English language publication, incidentally, which had published numerous articles on the phenomenon, on research that Japanese scientists had been doing for MIDI, which is their Ministry of Trade and Industry, and also for various private corporations within Japan, including Hitachi, including Sony, including Toyota, Mitsubishi. All the big Japanese corporations had some research interest in cold fusion. Now, the reason I find this interesting is if you put it into the historical context, and I mentioned this in my blogs, I'm going to briefly mention it here, is if you've read my books, you'll recall in The Philosopher's Stone, I talk about Japanese experiments back in the 1920s and 30s that were detecting nuclear transformations of a similar type of nature in similar sorts of room temperature experiments. And at the same time, the Germans are detecting this. So we're looking at a phenomenon that for the Japanese, when cold fusion was reported, they would have remembered these historical experiments earlier in their scientific history. And I think it's rather interesting that, in my opinion, Dr. Malov had to be silenced. And you had all this cold fusion research going on in Japan. I don't think these are entirely coincidental. There's another connection I want to mention in connection with Dr. Malov's death. And that is that Nazi scientist that I've written so much about in my books down in Argentina doing precisely sort of room temperature. That's a euphemistic way of putting it. But in other words, fusion experiments at much lower temperature thresholds than the standard model of fusion reactions would say are necessary. That scientist's name was, of course, Dr. Ronald Richter. Now, the interesting thing is that Dr. Malov, in his research, in his years of investigating and following the cold fusion story, he actually picked up on the Ronald Richter story and realized that, hey, this man was on to something that was very similar to what Pons and Fleischmann, and then later the Japanese scientists that published so many papers on cold fusion. So watch for those 2 articles. I think you're going to be kind of interested in them, and they draw certain dots and obvious connections to what may have been possible motivations for what's going on today. So anyway, that's news and views for Friday. I might be back this weekend because there's so much going on in the world. It's kind of hard to keep up. It depends on how much energy I'm going to have left after tonight's vid chat. So anyway, have a good weekend, everybody, and I'll see you on the flip side.